I never thought a Tuesday could change everything, but then, I never thought HOA politics could come with a wrecking ball either. The morning started like any other, coffee gone cold at my kitchen island, seagulls arguing over a scrap by the shore, and the kind of quiet that belongs to people who own more land than they need and still love the silence. My lake mansion sat on a gentle slope that looked down on the valley like a crown placed on green velvet. Family photos lined the hallway, heirlooms gathered dust in careful corners, and the smell of pine from the nearby trees was as constant as the tide. At 9 a.m., a truck with community services on the side rolled up the drive. I waved through the glass of my office and went back to the spreadsheet I'd been ignoring. The truck idled. A half hour later, an envelope slid under my front door. Stamped, formal, and ridiculous. Unpaid fees. A lien. The HOA claimed I owed money for landscaping. Fines for a statue they said violated some obscure covenant. Penalties for a mailbox post that leaned the wrong way in 2003. I read the letter twice, then 3 times, trying to find the comma that would change the meaning so it could be forgiven. I called my lawyer. He answered on the second ring, more annoyed than surprised. "We'll get it fixed," he said. "Don't do anything dramatic." I promised. Then I walked outside. The valley was waking. A thin fog hovered above the lake, silver threads catching the sun. The HOA's orange cones dotted the gravel road like a line of ants marking territory. At the turn by the old oak, men in hard hats directed a steady parade of equipment down the path toward my property. Bulldozers, loaders, men with radios. My blood went cold with a peculiar ice that comes from the feeling of losing control. I met them at the gate. A woman wearing a crisp blazer and hairspray that fought the wind approached with a clipboard stacked with documents. Her name was Rita. People called her the HOA president. She smiled like someone delivering news they'd already rehearsed. "Orders," she said, tapping her clipboard. "From the board. Unpaid fines. The property is in violation. We're authorized to perform enforcement actions." Her voice was official and light, like someone reading a script. Behind her, an excavator idled like an impatient shark. "This has to be a mistake," I said. "I haven't received notice except that envelope." She blinked, then produced another stack of papers, crisp and stamped, with a sequence of figures that meant nothing to her but everything to the machine that decides who loses a home. "Multiple notices have been sent," she said. "We have no choice." "Let them produce proof," I said. "You can't just—" They produced the proof. Signed forms, records, a docket number, a judgment from some clerical process I had never imagined would touch a place where my grandchildren would play. I called the judge listed on the paper. The clerk, politely distant, told me it was all as recorded. The law moves in strange and faceless ways if it believes paperwork is its deity. It should have stopped there. A proper apology, a refund, an embarrassed retreat. But people who hold authority like a talisman don't always feel embarrassment. They feel power. They called the county inspector. They prepared the orders. They carved my life into parcels and stamped them as due. The machine started at noon. They moved like hungry beasts. Thorny hedges that had been trimmed by my mother's hands for 40 years were torn out. The driveway, my marked stones, the rose garden planted with my wife's laughter were ripped apart like a page torn from a book. Neighbors watched from across the road, some with phones, some with tears, some with the curious abstinence of people who assume calamity happens to other people. I stood at my porch and felt each jarring thud as if it were someone knocking the breath out of me. "Stop!" I shouted. My voice was small compared to the roar. They shouted, "Back! Enforcement order!" like a prayer. By 3, the bulldozer had gouged the terrace where my father proposed to my mother. A crew leader, a man with kind eyes and a human face, paused for a second. "We have to follow orders," he said quietly, almost apologetically. I wanted to tell him the story of the bench, the time my daughter learned to ride a bike right there, the nights we lit candles for storms. How do you tell an excavator to hold its breath? How do you ask a shovel to respect memory? We barreled through legalities until the lake seemed to hold its breath with me. My lawyer arrived, tie undone, and tried to work the paperwork like a locksmith picking a stubborn lock. We filed an injunction, demanded a halt, and for a moment, hope fluttered like a small bird in a high branch. But the injunction had been filed against the wrong party. A clerical error. The county's pre-approval allowed work to continue. A tiny comma had the weight of a brick. This is how bureaucracy becomes a steamroller. I roamed through the rubble of the morning, scattered garden gnomes, broken glass, a child's discarded sneaker, trying to find points where I could root my argument. My house looked like a movie set after the director decided the scene needed fire. The kitchen window was gone, the piano was toppled, and its keys scattered like teeth. I found a photograph with a jagged tear through my mother's smile. That night, the valley hummed. There were fewer lights in the distance. Word spread in the way secrets travel along county roads, sometimes fast, sometimes in bursts. Social media picked it up. A neighbor posted a shaky clip with the caption, "HOA demolishes mansion for unpaid fees." It got a few dozen shares, then 100, then hundreds. People began to invent stories to fill in the spaces. Rich person refuses to obey rules. Wealthy owner who thinks they are above the law. Narrative slid in to fill the silence. Then something odd happened. A young reporter showed up with a recorder and eyes that looked like they'd been flipping through the right side of life. She wanted to know names, motives, details. I talked, because what else do you do when your life is the headline? I told the truth. That night, the story took a sharper edge. The HOA had overstepped. Officials were called. There were interviews and maps, and a curious comfort in speaking the truth into a microphone. My phone exploded with messages. Some supportive, some shrill, some from old friends who remembered picnics on the lawn. 2 days later, an envelope arrived with a title that made my heart stop. Notice of settlement. The HOA had agreed. Quietly, I learned later in a meeting arranged by someone with a loud voice and a video crew that mistakes had been made. There would be restitution, repairs, apologies. They promised to rebuild my roof, plant new trees, compensate for the pain. Mercy, the kind with signatures and dollar signs, was offered as if it were an afterthought. I should have felt content. I should have accepted the check, shook the hands of the guilty, and moved on. But life never arranges itself neatly. The valley had its own gravitational pull of secrets. That night, while sifting through follow-up emails, I noticed something about the list of properties attached to the HOA board's meeting minutes. Something small, a parcel number, a name. My name, but not the whole of it. My holding company's name. I dug deeper because curiosity sharpened into suspicion and suspicion into a tool. They had filed the enforcement action against me as an individual, but their paperwork referenced a different entity for tax purposes. A company I'd quietly established years ago for family trusts, land preservation, and charitable work. A holding company that, among other things, owned dozens of properties across the valley. Cottages, tenanted farmland, fishing rights, the old mill that turned the river at the bend. The more I pulled, the more I saw that the HOA's domain was a mere stripe of jurisdiction on a map I helped shape. I contacted my corporate counsel. He answered with a laugh that had a tip of disbelief. We reviewed titles, easements, mineral rights, covenants on top of covenants. There, buried like a relic under paperwork, was the truth. My trust held the title to the valley's common lands. That meant the HOA's authority was, in at least several significant ways, built on sand. If the HOA had the gall to demolish a mansion owned by someone with sway over their territory, they had underestimated the legal foundations they were walking on. I arranged a meeting at the community hall. The same people who had marched with bulldozers to my door now sat in folding chairs and looked like a chorus between defiance and dread. Rita sat at the head of the table, the same clipboard now a lifeless prop. I opened with the facts and watched their faces turn various shades of realization. I spoke plainly. You have trespassed. You have damaged property. You have enforced against the wrong legal identity. I recited parcel numbers, dates, clauses. It was a slow reveal, like turning the pages of an old ledger until the truth stepped into the light. They sputtered, then tried the oldest trick in the book. Blame the contractor, blame the clerk, blame the storm that caused this paperwork to blow off a desk. The contractor looked at his boots. The clerk claimed they relied on public records. Their voices were small boats in a storm of evidence. I held up the deed and the trust documents like a lighthouse. Now, I could have turned my wrath into cages. I could have filed suits that would have bled them dry, foreclosed on little strips of their common ground, and used the courtrooms like scythes. I could have made a public spectacle that would have chewed through reputations like a bear through honeycombs. But dismantling a community is not the same as teaching a lesson. I wanted the valley intact, the cottages, the bakery with cinnamon buns on Saturdays, the kids who raced boats at the dock in the summer. I wanted repair, not ruin. So I did something measured but irreversible. I proposed a remediation, a plan stitched together with both legal muscle and the kind of mercy a person remembers when they look back at the end. The HOA would issue a full apology, fund a restoration project under my oversight, and restructure its governance to prevent this from ever happening again. They would adopt transparent billing, an independent review board, and penalties for overreach. In return, I would drop the punitive suits that would have shattered lives and livelihoods in a valley that depended on neighbors more than notes in a ledger. They agreed, and they signed, and the valley exhaled. We rebuilt the mansion not as an act of vanity, but as an opportunity to model what stewardship could look like. The gardeners, those same hands that had once planted my roses, were rehired. The piano was restored, its wood carefully sanded back to a shine that threw back the summer sun. We installed a small memorial in the garden, a plaque about mistakes and the work it takes to right them. School children were invited to tours where they learned how civic systems work and why questions matter more than compliance without thought. Rita, the woman with the clipboard, resigned. She sent me a letter later, handwritten, with apologies that read like someone who had swallowed shame and slowly learned to speak it. She joined the review board, oddly enough, to help oversee the reforms she had once enforced so blindly. People change when systems require it, and when they see the faces of consequences. It's not always pretty, but it is sadly human. Years later, the valley felt whole again. There were markets by the shore, and fishermen traded stories instead of debts. The HOA's leadership rotated, and a culture of transparency took root like a slow-growing oak. I received invitations to community dinners where my name was called with less suspicion and more curiosity. I took my seat at the table when asked, and I refused to be a distant landlord. Instead, I let the valley know that owning land is not a permit to ignore people. It's a responsibility to listen, to steward, and to repair when you err. Ownership is a strange thing. It is power, yes, but also a promise. That day, the HOA drove their machines to my door because of unpaid fees. They did not know who they'd provoked. They assumed an old man in a lake mansion was an easy target, a story that fit a headline. They were wrong. They were wrong because they had not read the documents, but more importantly, they were wrong because they had forgotten human meaning in the machinery of enforcement. In the end, the valley belonged to a community that had learned to rebuild itself without tearing apart the people who lived there. My mansion stood again, quieter now, filled with the intentional sound of conversation over clinking plates. We never returned to the hush that had once been my favorite companion. The valley preferred laughter now to the silence of distant ownership. Sometimes I'd walk down to the lake and watch the children who had once watched bulldozers with fear now sail tiny paper boats and laugh when the wind tipped them. Sometimes justice is loud and messy, sometimes it is quiet and crafted. I chose the latter. The valley taught me that the best revenge is repair, and the best ownership is presence. When the seasons turned and the lake mirrored the sky without scars, I sat on the restored terrace and finally felt the slow, steady grounding of a place that had been scared and then healed. That, more than anything, felt like victory. Stay kind, okay?